Hello everyone, welcome to another one of our Marvel Bible studies. Today we're going to be discussing Avengers Infinity War. Definitely a long time coming, but I'd like to begin in John chapter 10, verse 10, maybe one you're familiar with by now, but in noting the active illustration and Bible passage we've been referring to when noting contrast, something that Hebrew culture lived and breathed off of. Making that contrast, Jesus says, the thief does not come except to steal and to kill and to destroy. That's all he would have to offer. I have come that they may have life and may have it more abundantly. Now, before we get into the biblical message of this movie, I want to first point out a few biblical references that directly were made in this film before we clarify the difference between Thanos and Jesus. Spoiler alert as far as the focus of the study goes. First of all, we saw the 7 days of creation and Genesis 1 compared to the 6 infinity stones, and when his work was completed, he rested and, watched the sunrise on a grateful universe. There was definitely a reference to that. It noted in Genesis chapter 1 that in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth. And noting this as well, in chapter 2, in verse 1, it says, "Thus says the heaven and the earth and all the host of them were finished. And on the seventh day God ended the work which he had done and rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done." So, noting that interesting reference, but in reference to how they used their power. That's what I want the focus to be on as we're getting set up into this, that Thanos wiped out half of life in the universe. God established a universe that could support life. Second, God's omnipotence. This means having all power. This could have been seen very well in the Infinity Gauntlet. In Jeremiah 32 and verse 27, God says to Jeremiah, "Behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is there anything too hard for me?" Obviously, this was rhetorical. What are the limits of what God is capable of? Well, here's an illustration. When God said to the universe, "Exist," and it went, "Yes, sir," we've pretty much established that bar is much higher than anything else we've seen on or beyond this earth. And then lastly, God's command to Abraham in Genesis chapter 22. And this is a big one. And when we compare that to the sacrifice of Gomorrah for the soul stone, I want you to pay careful attention to this. This is how the chapter begins. Genesis 22 and verse 1. "Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham,' he said, 'Here I am.' And he said, 'Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall tell you.'" Now, I want you to keep this in mind because we haven't read the whole story yet. We're going to get into that later on when we're going through all of these things. But keep in mind that God told Abraham, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love." And just a little fun fact for you, that's the first time that the word love appears in the Bible. A father's love for his only son. Maybe some foreshadowing there. But it's also worth noting the geography of this. Where was Moriah? Well, today it's known by a different name. We call it Jerusalem. Giving you guys a little taste. But now let's get into the focus of the study with this thought in mind. Thanos versus God. Two questions that I'd like to ask you in noting the differences. If we were to compare them as far as power was concerned, what does the power of God look like? Well, as what was mentioned before, literally the Infinity Gauntlet. Absolute power over time, space, reality, and life itself. It's what they did have in common with each other. We saw the power of God in the hands of a physical being. And in Thanos' case, it was scary. But then the second question comes along. What would the nature of God look like? According to the Bible, the God of the Bible, the God who's given himself a witness and demonstrated his power in human history, has been tested and verified to any fair inquirer's standards. What would God look like? Not just in power, if he came to this world in a way that we could see, because according to the Bible, God is spirit, John chapter 4, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. But note this, the power of God, obviously comparable to Thanos. But what about the nature of God? How would we describe him? What will we compare the nature of God to? What would he be like? Literally, Jesus of Nazareth. Perfect truth met with unconditional love. It's the difference between the two of them. Now, what did God do when he came to this world with skin on? Did he teleport in a blue vortex, take down the Avengers one by one with his power, come across with a light show, take care of his agenda, and then leave? Well, unfortunately, no. But understand this. Two very important things I want to make as far as a contrast between Thanos and Jesus Christ. Did he force death or offer life? Well, according to the Old Testament, the nature of God wasn't too keen on that sort of policy. Deuteronomy 30 and verse 19 says, I call heaven and earth as witnesses today against you. I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, what's his preference? Choose life, that both you and your descendants may live. And this was ultimately fulfilled when in John chapter 3, verses 16 through 17, Jesus, describing the whole purpose as to why he came, said this, For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. Which brings us to the second question. Did he have others die for him? Or did he himself die for us? Well, let's go back to that Genesis 22 passage and see if the Old Testament God falls in line with this sort of nature. Verse 6 says, So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, laid it on Isaac his son. Interesting, Isaac, the son, is carrying wood up a mountain. I wonder what that's a reference to. He took the fire from his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, My father. He said, Here I am, my son. Then he said, Look, the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb? Interesting that he said that. Where's the lamb for the offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So the two of them went together, and then they came to the place of which God had told them, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. He then bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Now, understand this. Abraham at this time in his life is around 120 with change. Very old. And also note as well, at this time in his life, Isaac would be around his early 30s. Interestingly enough, the same age Jesus was when he was crucified. But understand this as well. Do you think that Isaac could have resisted his father? Thought, oh, Dad, you're going senile. What are you doing here? He allowed this to happen. He trusted his father. He voluntarily allowed this to take place. And after placing his son on the wood, interestingly, he stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And so he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the lad, nor do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Wait, I thought this was an angel talking. It's the angel of the Lord, but notice that specification is unique in this context. He's referring to himself as God. You fear God. God gave you this order. The beginning of the chapter set this up. God speaking to Abraham with a message, because that's what angel means, by the way, a messenger. But catch this. You have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there was a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went, took the ram, and offered a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, "The Lord will provide." What again? As it is said to this day, "And on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." So we have a prophetic element to this, a prediction of the future where something else is going to take place on that mountain, where God will provide himself, literally, a sacrifice. Understand this as well. That's not only demonstrated in the Old Testament as the kind of character that God would demonstrate as someone who would rather prove integrity than take life, but understand this as well. What do we see fulfilled in this in the New Testament? Mark chapter 10 and verse 45. For the Son of Man, referring to Jesus, talking about himself, said, "He came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Quoting Gomorrah, when she was going to be offered on that mountain, said, "This is not love." And to that I would wholeheartedly agree. The power of God does not make you God. But when God came to this earth, what instead did we see? Well, the Apostle John, who bore witness to that moment, who was the only one of his disciples who was still there with him on the mountain, watching his Lord dying, took this away as far as a demonstration of God's character. 1 John 3 and verse 16. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us. And we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. So note the comparison and example. Thanos had a lot of power, almost comparable to God himself. But even if he could do anything that he wanted at a snap of his fingers, God didn't even need the fingers, he just had to speak. We serve not just a God, an absolutely powerful and ultimate being, the greatest possible being, what God means by definition, which in the Marvel universe is pretty much Thanos in a nutshell, the most powerful being we've ever seen, and he's a bad guy. But then tie that back and say, what's our reality? Not just that we have a God, but that he is a good one. Not one who forces death, but offers life. Not one who has others die for him, but himself first died for us. Understand the difference, because it's a big one. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. If you have any sincere questions or more topics you'd like to discuss that we're seeing paralleled in the Avengers Infinity War film, please leave them in the comments below. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, you know where to go. But most importantly, if you know someone who's familiar with this film, perhaps not these references, please share this study with anyone you feel would be blessed by it. Thank you for your time. Remember that Jesus loves you and how he's proven that in a moment of history. Not by saying, you die, but by saying, I will die for you.